Hello friends, Jeff here from House of Heresy. I'm back again with another deck tech video. This has been a weekly occurrence now for I think over a month. This might be our fifth video. But basically I go through one of my commander decks and just kind of talk about how I built it, why I built it, the cards that are in it, and my thought process behind it. As always, I am by no means an expert in building decks of any kind, especially commander. So I certainly am probably missing cards, getting things wrong. A lot of my choices are kind of based on availability. I don't necessarily go buy the best of everything that I can possibly get for these decks. And I do build some of these decks with different power levels in mind because I play with a lot of different people. And I don't want to just bring the most powerful deck I can to the table every single time. So with that said, let's jump right into it. So this is one of my newest decks that I built. If you've watched any of my other videos, especially when I was opening the Brothers War, I really enjoyed that set. That just was one of the most fun standard sets I think I have gotten to open in a long time. And part of why that was so much fun is because there's so many cool cards in there. And being almost pretty much purely a commander player outside of doing like Brawl and stuff on Arena, I really obviously enjoy the commander style cards. So between the meld cards and like a lot of the different characters and stuff that came out of there, a lot of the legendary creatures, there's just a ton of cards in there that made me want to build decks around them. And to me, that's the sign of a great set, because if I actually want to build a bunch of decks from a single set like that, then that doesn't happen very often. I usually am not that passionate about a group of cards that are coming out of these standard sets, at least not for the last few years. So first one that I built actually was Gixx, Yawgmoth Praetor. So Gixx is a Phyrexian. For those that aren't up on it, the Brothers War is looking back in time at the civil war between Urza and Mishra, the two brothers that are referenced there. And Gixx was sent by Yawgmoth to basically assist Mishra in the war there. So I know that's really dumbing down the lore. If you want to know more about it, there's plenty of better sources for that information, but that's the gist of it. So yeah, so Gixx, super fun card to play with. He is very entertaining. So he costs 2 black and a generic. So this is a mono black deck. This is the second mono colored commander deck that I've featured on the channel so far. So he's a 3/3, and he says, whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. So if anybody attacks anyone other than you, the person that's attacking and gets through with combat damage gets to pay a life to draw a card for each creature that does that. His second ability is you can pay 3 black and 4 generic to discard X cards. Exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. You may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. So basically the way this deck wants to play is it wants to get a lot of creatures out, so generally cheaper creatures out, and start swinging early to gain that card advantage. Pay that life, draw those cards until you get a sizable hand that lets you kind of move into the later stages of the game. The added benefit of drawing a bunch of cards and hopefully retaining them in your hand through some different cards that allow you to not worry about hand size is that when you reach a point where you could pay that 7 mana, you can discard your entire hand and basically get a whole group of cards on the battlefield for free. This is very situational based on who you're playing and what decks they have. But generally speaking, among my friend group, we have a couple players that play with some pretty high power decks, or at least they are powerful, but not in like a CDH sense, but like they play with like some really strong, big, good cards. So I tend to target them with that ability. And if I can get like 9 cards off the top, and say I'm playing against one of my friends who has an Dragon deck, I could drop a bunch of dragons on the battlefield for free. It tends to be game changing. And it can kind of come out of the blue because most of the game you're just sitting there, just dealing damage, drawing cards, losing life, and then suddenly you have like a 9 or 10 card hand, and you pay that 7 mana after your attack step, and just vomit a bunch of cool stuff on the board. And then just in general, he's pretty solid. 3 mana for a 3/3 is decent. Body-wise, he is susceptible to a lot of different forms of removal. However, with that first ability there, it's not Goad. It doesn't have quite as bad of a feel as Goad does, but it highly incentivizes your opponents to not attack you. So you generally don't have to worry as much about about Gixx getting taken out, because a lot of people want to do that, especially early in the game. They're happy to swing in on the unprotected player or players and draw some cards. And it really, that's generally the flow of the game. You might get some people that take advantage of that themselves and then blast Gixx on the next player's upkeep or something like that. But generally speaking, people like to take advantage of it, so Gixx tends to kind of get a free pass for a fair number of turns in my experience. So with that said, let's get into the deck itself. So the biggest part of this deck is creatures dealing combat damage, because you want to draw those cards. So there's a lot of different creatures over Magic's history that kind of help you accomplish that with minimal opposition from your opponent. So first couple creatures here do exactly what you want them to do. They can't be blocked, and they get in for damage. They're generally pretty cheap, but they're also pretty weak. And we'll talk about how we can change some of those outcomes a little bit there as we get into this. So Changeling Outcast is one, came in a MH1. Tormented Soul's another one, at a M12, just little 1/1s. Ginger Brute, for those that enjoyed Thrones of Eldraine. You do have to pay 1 to get him to not be blocked, and he can still be blocked by creatures with haste, so you have to kind of be cognizant of what's on the board there. But with him having haste himself, a lot of times it's a great turn 1 play. Even though Gixx isn't out there, you're still getting in and chipping away. Because overall, this deck generally wants to win, or put the board in a state where it's easier to win with the combat damage. And you'll probably find as you play this deck more and more that the life totals stay pretty equitable as they are all going down, including your own. It is pretty rare, unless somebody's like doing a hardcore life gain deck, for any one person to have a ton of life, because everyone's just kind of slowly chipping their way down. Because even if they're not getting hit, they're probably doing damage to other people and taking damage by drawing those cards. So the more ways that we can facilitate that by doing damage ourselves, the better. And having unblockable creatures is a great way to do it. And then, of course, you get into some of the other unblockable mechanics, or semi-unblockable, like Shadow, which you need another creature with Shadow to be able to block. Of course, Douthie Voidwalker is just a great card in general. For those that don't know, he came out of Modern Horizons 2, and his big deal, besides being a 2-mana 3/2 with Shadow, is that if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it, and then you can tap and sack him to choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it, and you can play this card. You can play it this turn without paying its mana cost. So it pretty much exiles everybody's stuff. It shuts down a lot of decks that want to interact with their graveyard, because everything's going into exile. And it just so happens that Shadow is a great mechanic for this deck. So even though he is an amazing card in and of himself, he actually fits the theme very nicely. Another Trader is another one that's got Shadow, and he does have haste as well. You can get him back. He is 2-mana 1/1, but with haste and Shadow, he has some upside, and then you can pay 1 if another creature goes into the graveyard and return him to the battlefield, which is pretty nice. Nice way to recur him. Then you got Vampire Cutthroat, who has Skulk. It's you kind of have to keep an eye on the board state. You obviously don't want to swing into a field of like elf tokens or something, but especially as it gets later in the game, it's less and less likely that he'll be able to be blocked. And he has lifelink, so you can get some of that life back that you're spending. All right, then we get into some of the more traditional ways to just incentivize your opponents not to block with their creatures, first of which being Death Touch. With that said, this card in general could just as easily be the commander of this deck, and she is amazing. This is probably one of the best cards in the deck, I would say. And I know it's expensive. Definitely, we'll see if the reprint in Phyrexians will be one changes the price point at all. But She is just such a good card for this set. She enables some of the alternate win cons that we have. So she's a 4-mana 4/5 with Death Touch. So right there, already great value. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. So you basically are net positive 1 life every time you use Gixx's ability while Shieldred's on the board. And whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So that means that if they're taking advantage of Gixx, they're losing 3 life per card. And at that point, you're probably not going to see a lot of opponents choosing to go that route because that's a really hefty price for card draw unless they're just desperate. But she does a lot of, she's an enabler for a lot of the other cards that we'll talk about later on, but very, very strong. If you're going to run this deck, she is almost a must include there. Ashnod, she's a 1-mana, 1/1 with Death Touch is the main reason why she's in here. Her other abilities are whenever she attacks, you can sack another creature and create a tapped Power Stone token. Highly situational. I generally want to keep my creatures on the board. I could maybe see some value in this if you wanted to like recur. What was his name? The shadow guy there, the Nether Trader. If you wanted to recur the Nether Trader, that might be a possibility. But generally, Power Stones aren't super useful. Well, I shouldn't say that because we do have a lot of artifacts in this deck, especially equipment. So I could potentially see it, especially with some of the token generation we'll talk about later. I'm not going to discount it. I just don't do it very often. It doesn't come up a lot. I usually just want the Death Touch on the board. And then you can also pay 5 to exile a creature from your graveyard to create a tapped 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. I could see this one being used a little bit more. Generally, by the time that would matter for me in the game, I'm doing other things, but just getting bodies on the board is nice. And again, she's a 1-mana 1/1 with Death Touch. That alone is good enough for me to put her in the deck, but the added abilities are just bonuses there. So very strong for what she does. I would highly recommend her. Tainted Adversary, this one came out of Midnight Hunt. This is part of the adversary cycle. So 1 and a black with Death Touch and 2/3, and then when he ETBs, you can pay 2 and a black any number of times, and when you pay this cost 1 or more times, you put that many 1/1 counters on Tainted Adversary and create twice that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decayed. If you have him in your hand and early in the game, you're probably just going to pay the 1 and a black and just get a 2/3 Death Touch on the board. Late in the game, this could be really good if you want to just get bodies through contacting your opponent's face to help generate that card draw. So being able to generate those zombies can definitely have some value there. So again, a 2-mana 2/3 with Death Touch is good enough, but the added benefits there are definitely helpful. All right, Foulmire Knight. This one is for the creature. It's one black and is a 1/1 with Death Touch, which is quite good. But you can also pay 2 and a black to draw a card and lose a life. It could be beneficial. I don't do that very often. The Profane Insight side of the card, the adventure side. But having the option is nice. The utility of the card is nice. At its most basic level, a 1-mana 1/1 with Death Touch is good enough. But again, the utility is nice. Battlefly Swarm. This is a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, and then you can pay 1 black to give it Death Touch until end of the turn. Flying's another one of those keywords that a lot of times will enable us to connect with an opponent's face for Gixx. Not every deck is able to block flyers, and a lot of them aren't going to prioritize that because a 1/1 flyer is not a huge danger point, generally speaking. It's great value for us because we want to draw those cards and chip away. But it is able to defend itself by gaining Death Touch. So that is nice as well. It's one of those ones that you don't mind keeping back as a blocker if it comes up, just to help off one of your opponent's creatures. Or if they do have flyers, to disincentivize them to block, because there aren't too many people that are playing 1-mana flyers to where it's an equitable trade. A lot of times you're going to end up, if they do want to block you, they're going to end up losing a bigger creature. So just a good card. Evolved Sleeper. This one's, you start it with 1 black and it's a 1/1. You can pay a 2nd black and it becomes a 2/2. And then you can pay 1 and a black and it becomes a cleric with Death Touch and becomes a 3/3. And then you can finally pay 2 black and 1 generic. It becomes a Phyrexian and you can put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card and lose a life. So I generally will stop at the middle one there, 3/3 with Death Touch. If I really just have a bunch of mana to burn, which is the case sometimes, as you'll see, we do have ways to generate a lot of mana, potentially more than what we can spend it on because of the low CMC or the low mana value curve of this deck. So I could see maybe pumping them up a bunch of times with that last one, but generally speaking, I'll spend that 4 mana to make him a 3/3. Usually not right away, and a lot of times these abilities can be done at instant speed essentially. So you can let your opponents declare their attackers, then you say, okay, I'm going to block, and I'm going to make him a 3/3 with Death Touch and murder whatever it is that you're blocking. So it's a good utility card. In and of itself, a 1 mana 1/1's not that great, but the other abilities, the additional investment in him can pay off in the long run there. I got the Vampire Nighthawk, is 2 black and a generic for a 2/3 flyer Death Touch lifelink. It's got all the keywords that we like to see there. Flying is great, Death Touch, excellent, and then lifelink. I don't prioritize it in and of itself in this deck, but I do have a decent number of creatures with lifelink, and that goes a long way to offsetting the cost of Gixx. So if you're getting back a couple life for every 4 or 5 life that you're spending on card draw, it makes it a little bit more palatable and keeps you more in line with the rest of the pod or the rest of the table in terms of how much damage you're taking compared to them. So, and for 3 mana, this one's really just a lot of solid keywords on there. So I think it's got good value. Phyrexian Fleshgorger, another one of those great Brothers War cards. So you can pay 7 mana to get a 7/5 with Menace and Lifelink, and ward pay life equal to Phyrexian Fleshgorger's power. I do like to do that because it really, especially with how much life is lost quickly in games that have Gixx at the table, it becomes a lot harder for your opponent to single target remove this Fleshgorger if they're about to lose a third of their life, if they're in like the low 20s. The other option is you can pay 2 black and a generic for the prototype, which means that he gets all this text, but he's a 3/3 instead of a 7/5. Menace is another one of those keywords that's great for this deck, especially if you can get the Menace creatures out kind of early, because it really it makes it challenging for your opponents, whoever you're swinging in on. If they only have 1 creature, then that's great. They're essentially unblockable. If they have more than 1, then suddenly you're enabling other creatures to get through if they want to block the Menace creature, or maybe they just don't want to bother dedicating 2 creatures to block the Menace creature, so that means that he gets through while your other attacking creatures soak up the blockers. It's just a really good card, and again, like having that versatility. A lot of you've kind of seen a lot of the cards in this deck have a main purpose, but they also have the utility of other capabilities that actually get value in this deck. So the prototype's nice. If I can cast him with the 7 cost, I do try to do that because he's just a pain to deal with, and he's got lifelink. So you will probably be getting more life back than you're spending on cards with Gixx, because I try to go wide with this deck, but it's not super common that I would be connecting with 7 creatures to my opponent's faces in a turn. That's just unlikely unless somebody's just wide open and you're swinging everything in at them. But great card. Knight of Dust Shadow. This is a 1 and a black for a 2/2 with Menace. The next line there can be huge. Your opponents can't gain life. This shuts down a lot of decks, especially decks that would otherwise be challenging for Gixx to defeat. In this one card, because I've also built this deck in Arena as a historic Brawl deck, which is essentially like Commander for those that have never done it. Brawl, the main difference between Brawl and Commander is that Brawl lets you pick, you can choose any Planeswalker as a Commander instead of just Planeswalkers that say that they can be your Commander. But otherwise, it's your same building requirements. It's all singleton. It has to be a legendary creature or a Planeswalker. And then it's 1-on-1. So the games play very differently because it's essentially just almost like a normal game of Magic where it's you and an opponent. You just are playing with a 100-card deck, singleton format, and a commander. So a lot of times the games tend to be very much faster paced. You see a lot more aggro in those types of matchups there. But anyways, yeah. So your opponents can't gain life is huge in that format too. Because the other thing with Historic Brawl is you also start at 25 life instead of 40. So it makes a big difference when you can't gain that life back. But even in Commander, this is a really strong card. So for 2 mana with Menace, you're already coming out ahead. Or you're at a decent level. It's not the greatest stats, but the utility of not letting your opponents gain life is huge. And then the last ability is you can pay black and a generic. Knight of Dust Shadow gets +1/+1 till end of turn. So you can pump him up if you got a bunch of mana to spend, which is pretty nice on a Menace creature. So just a really good card, very strong. Null Priest of Oblivion, this is one of my favorite cards. I use it in Gruta quite a bit. Just a lot of fun, great way to get value back. So she, at her most basic level, is 1 generic and black for a 2/1 with Menace and Lifelink. And you can also pay the kicker cost of 3 generic and black, so she becomes a 6 mana value creature. If you kick her, you can return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So there's less value, or the situation, or the value is more situational in this deck than in a deck like Gruta, where I have a bunch of big creatures that it's great to get them back out on the battlefield. In this deck, as you've seen, a lot of the creatures are small. But with that said, if you have like Shieldred in the graveyard, or the Phyrexian Fleshgorger in the graveyard, or something like that, it's great value to be able to pull them back out. And on top of that, she's a 2/1 Menace with Lifelink, so she's probably going to get through in a lot of times, and she's going to get you some life back. So just a really solid card in this deck. Shakedown Heavy. This is one of the new Capenna cards. So 2 generic and a black for a 6/4 with Menace. However, whenever Shakedown Heavy attacks, defending player may have you draw a card. If they do, untap Shakedown Heavy, remove it from combat. So you basically get the card draw, which is what you want anyways, without having to pay the life. The downside is you're not doing 6 damage to your opponent, but most of the time they're just going to let you draw the card instead of having to block a 6/4 or taking the 6 damage. So it's a net positive because you're not losing the life. And for 3 mana, it's hard not to justify putting this card in there. It's just a good card with this deck. All right, Vault Scourge. It's 1 and a Phyrexian, so you can either pay the black or you can pay 2 life. It's got flying and lifelink, so it's just a solid little card. A lot of times you can get it out very early for just one mana, which is nice in and of itself. It's got flying, so it's less likely to be blocked, and it's got lifelink, so it's getting you life back. So just a good little card to throw in there. Rankle, Master of Pranks at a Throne of Eldraine. So this one's got 2 and 2 black for a 3/3 with flying, haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose any number. Each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. All of these can be valuable, all of these can be valuable at different times of the game. So this is another great utility card. It is a 4/4 with flying and haste, so you have a good chance of getting immediate value if Gixx is already on the table. You get that card draw. You would actually probably get 2 card draw because most of the time you're going to, at a minimum, pick that each player loses a life and gains a card. But being able to force your opponents to sack creatures is great. Being able to force your opponents to discard cards can be good depending on what's out on the battlefield. So it's just a pretty solid card. This is one of the, as you've seen, one of the more expensive creatures, but I think he definitely has some value. Horde Robber is 1 and a black for a 1/3, and whenever he deals combat damage, create a treasure token. So this is just one that you get added value to dealing combat damage, which is what you want. And then Grim Hireling is 3 and a black, and whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, generate 2 treasure tokens. So it doesn't have to be him. You can play him, and then one of your other creatures deals that damage, and you get 2 treasure. And then you can pay a black to sacrifice X treasure. Target creature gets -X until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. I honestly have not used the second ability there. It just hasn't been super necessary for me. But the top part's great. This deck likes to, because of how much card draw we have, this deck likes to have access to more mana than black might otherwise want or need. So having that extra ability to recast Gixx or even get, well, you're probably not going to get Gixx out early because you could pay for him before you could pay for this guy. But it's just nice to have the treasure because that gives us more options. So pretty good. Defiler Flesh, this one, this is another one out of Dominaria United. So it's 2 black and 2 generic. It's a 4/4 with Menace. This is part of the Defiler cycle. So as an additional cost to cast a black permanent, you may pay 2 life, and then, so you're basically getting a Phyrexian mana on each, the option to get 1 Phyrexian mana on each black permanent spell that you cast. So again, it's only permanents, so it doesn't count for the instants or sorceries, and you can only do it for one of your black mana costs for each of those permanents. And then whenever you cast a black permanent spell, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains Menace until end of turn. So this is another great enabler to allow an extra creature to get through, or force your opponent to make more tough decisions about blocks. And he's a 4/4 with Menace himself, so that's already pretty strong. But just the enabler to be able to pump even more of your creatures onto the battlefield, or artifacts or enchantments. We have a fair number of all the above that we want to use this for, because again, we have some life gain in this deck with all the lifelink creatures, so we don't mind paying that life to get value out of it. Dread Presence, since we are mono black, we do have a decent number of swamps in the deck, so you pay 3 generic and a black for a 3/3, and whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control, choose one. You can draw a card and lose a life, which we do all the time anyways, or Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. So this could be useful. It's a little situational, but it might help you get an extra creature through, gain a little bit of life, and then you still get that card draw when the creature that's no longer being blocked gets to draw a card and you lose a life. So for 4 mana. Again, this is on the more expensive end of our creature spectrum here, but I think it's worth it. I think it's a decent value for being in there. Psychosis Crawler, 5 mana. And its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand, and whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses a life. So it's a nice way to ping down your opponents while you're drawing cards, and the chance of you having a pretty good size hand size is decent until you use Gixx's second ability. So this could be quite a large creature. It could be upwards of 7, 8, or 9, depending on, or even higher, depending on how many cards you're holding on to in your hand. I think it's worth it for being in here. Again, it's 5 mana. It's pretty expensive for the deck, but there is some upside, and just having it on the board, even if it's only like a 2/2, you're still getting value by pinging your opponents down for all your card draw. So I think it's worth it. Creeping Bloodsucker. This is one it's not bad. It just doesn't add as much to the overall theme of the deck, but again, it helps bring your opponent's lives down. At the beginning of your upkeep, Creeping Bloodsucker deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So you're pinging all your opponents and hopefully getting more life back, which allows you to be less concerned about paying that life to draw cards with Gixx. So it's just for two mana, it's a nice way to gain a little bit extra life each turn. Raven Man, kind of situational, but he is a 1 and a black for a 2/1. At the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, create a 1/1 black bird creature token with flying, and this creature can't block. So that's kind of where it's nice, because your opponents are incentivized to attack other opponents and draw cards, which may lead to a situation where they're going to discard a card, and it's each end step. Actually, I guess that probably wouldn't, because that'd be in the cleanup step. Anyways, so point being, there's a lot of reasons why your opponents might feel the need to discard cards. I wouldn't say that this is a must include. In fact, I would probably, if I was truly optimized with this deck, I wouldn't include it. However, being able to create the 1/1s is nice, because that's just extra creatures for you to attack with if it works out. Again, this isn't the greatest addition, but he does have some value and utility. And then you can also pay 3 generic and a black to tap him and have every opponent discard a card. So you do have a little way to, or you do have a way to generate a bird. I probably wouldn't pay 4 mana for a 1/1, but I mean, maybe it's worthwhile. Gixian Puppeteer. He's 3 generic and a black for 4/3. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So you're probably going to be drawing a minimum an extra card each turn with Gixx on the battlefield. So this is just a nice way to gain a little extra life and make your opponents lose a couple life. Now whenever he dies, you can return another target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, which, as you've seen, most of the creatures in this deck are 3 or less. So you're probably going to get value out of that when they kill him. And he's a 4/3, so he's got decent stats on him there. Op Agent, this is one that's just good in pretty much every mono black deck. It's just a nice way to interact with your opponents. For those that aren't familiar with this card, you pay 2 generic and a black for a 3/2 with Flash, and you control your opponents while they're searching their libraries. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. You may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. So this is one of those very salt-inducing cards coming out of Commander Legends, this along with Hullbreaker, and to a lesser degree, or maybe a greater degree, depending on your perspective, Jeweled Lotus were like the big 3 that like kind of were sending people into fits of rage, but there's really no reason not to include this in a mono black deck. It's just we don't have a lot of this type of interaction available to us, so it's nice. And it's a 3/2 with Flash, so you could, worst case, flash it in on your opponent's end step so that you can swing with her right after. And then finally, Bitter Blossom. This is not a creature. However, it generates creatures. You can pay 1 and a black, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. So this is a great way to generate a larger board state with a bunch of 1/1 flyers that will either help you block or will help you draw cards. So worth putting in there, in my opinion, especially for 2 mana. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the enablers for our wanting to attack, and starting with a bunch of equipment. So first we're going to look at Thieves' Tools. So this is 1 generic and a black. When it ETBs, you create a treasure token. Already nice. 2 mana for a treasure token is good, decent value there. And then equipped creature can't be blocked as long as its power is 3 or less. And as you've seen, a good chunk of our creatures are power 3 or less. So this basically just makes a creature unblockable, and the equip cost is 2. So very strong addition. Quietus Spike, you pay 3 mana to cast it, 3 mana to equip it. Equipped creature has Death Touch, which is one of the keywords that we're looking for in this deck. And whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up. So this is a great way to really chunk down somebody and put them within reach of you or your opponents. So if you can connect with this, put it on an unblockable creature or something like that, even a 1/1 is going to do way more than that 1 damage when this guy connects. So very decent card. Shadow Spear. This is one of the classic equipments. Came out of Theros. So you pay 1 generic and you pay 2 to equip it. Equipped creature has +1/+1 and has trample and lifelink. And you can pay 1 at any point in time, whether it's equipped or not. Permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible till end of turn. So this is a wonderful way to assist in board wipes if somebody has some sort of indestructible creature out there, or a bunch of creatures, or they've made all their artifacts indestructible, what have you. Just a really solid card, and the cost is very low and the equip cost is reasonable. So all around good. Pact Weapon. This one's a fun one. So you can pay 3 generic and a black. As long as Pact Weapon is attached to a creature, you don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. This is quite helpful in a deck that is constantly losing life to gain value by generating card draw. So as long as you can keep this equipped to somebody, you are a lot less concerned about using Gixx's ability, especially later in the game when everyone's life total is getting low. And then whenever a equipped creature attacks, draw a card and reveal it. The creature gets +X/+X till end of turn, where X is, and you lose X life, where X is that card's mana value. And then to equip it, you just discard a card. So this one's got a lot of upside and really not a ton of downside. The losing X life can be a little bit rough. However, you're already not losing the game because of that. So you might have your 1/1 that's equipped with this suddenly swinging in for an extra 4, 5, or 6 damage because of whatever card you drew. And you're drawing a card, by the way. So it's a pretty decent card. I know that this isn't seeing like a ton of play for the most part, but I think in this deck it's pretty solid equipment. And you got Reaper's Talisman. You can pay 1 black and 2 generic to equip it. Whenever equipped creature attacks, it gains Death Touch, again, keyword we want. And whenever equipped creature attacks alone, defending player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this one's great early on because it can enable you to get a little extra life, especially before Gixx is coming out while still doing some damage. And then just having your attacking creatures pick up Death Touch is nice because that de-incentivizes your opponents to block with them. Basilisk Collar, this one just came out, or just got reprinted in Baldur's Gate. Can pay 1 generic and 2 generic to equip. Equipped creature has Death Touch and Lifelink, 2 keywords we love to see in this deck. Then we got Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves. Essentially do the same thing, just you have to pay 1 to equip it, and it's got Hexproof, and then you can pay 0, and it's got Shroud. But otherwise gives them both haste and protection from a lot of stuff. Key to the City is not equipment, but it does exactly what we want our creatures to do by making them unblockable. So you can pay 2 generic, and it's just an artifact, not equipment. Then you can tap to discard a card, and up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. Very helpful. And then whenever it becomes untapped, you can pay 2 generic, and if you do draw a card. So on your untapped step, you could pay 2 and draw a card if you are swimming in mana, or if you really want the card draw without the life loss. It's just a nice way to get a little extra value there. So it's a good, all-around good. Doubt the Embrace is 2 generic and a black enchantment. And then you can pay 2 black, target creature gains shadow until end of turn. So essentially making them unblockable in almost every situation. So nice, again, another nice enabler to help you get through for your combat damage. And finally, Font of Agonies. For this deck, this card is amazing. Very, very useful for 1 black. I don't know why you wouldn't put it in here because I don't think it's a very expensive card either. So you can pay 1 black, and whenever you pay life, put that many blood counters on Font of Agonies. And we pay lots of life because we want to draw lots of cards. So getting this out with a decent board state means you're probably going to get a bunch of blood counters right away. And then you can pay 1 generic and a black to remove 4 blood counters from Font of Agonies, destroy target creature. So as long as you're connecting pretty regularly every turn, you could be popping creatures pretty much every turn. So it's a very, very strong card for that 1 mana cost. And you're almost certainly going to be generating a bunch of blood counters with Gixx on the battlefield. And some of the other, we have other cards that are having us spend life to draw cards or what have you. So anytime you do that, anytime you pay that life, you get to put a blood counter on there. So highly recommend this card for Gixx. It is super useful. All right, and then we're going to look at some cards that either punish or reward card draw. So first up, Underworld Dreams. I know this card used to be a powerhouse back in the day. It's kind of lost favor over the years, but you can pay 3 black, and whenever an opponent draws a card, Underworld Dreams deals 1 damage to him or her. So this works great in conjunction with Gixx, because now they're paying 2 life, essentially, to draw that card, which most people are probably more willing to do than with Shieldred, making it 3 life. If you also have Shieldred on the board, then just at a minimum, they're losing 3 life a turn on their card draw step, or on their draw step. So it's just very good for what this deck does. And it could be a win con depending on the board state, with some of the other cards we're going to talk about here in a few. Okay, this is another one. I've actually won games with this card having Shieldred on the board. So Teferi's Puzzle Box, you can pay 4. It's an artifact. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player puts the cards in their hand on the bottom of their library in any order, then draws that many cards. So if you have a 7-card hand and Shieldred's on the battlefield, at the beginning of your draw step, you are going to draw 7 cards and lose 14 life. And towards the end of the game, that can be devastating. And like I said, I've won the game with this card. And Shieldred on the battlefield. I played it on my turn, passed the turn, and then my next opponent drew cards to kill themselves, my next opponent drew cards to kill themselves, and my last opponent drew cards to kill themselves. So, and I didn't have to do anything except pay 4 mana and put an artifact on the battlefield, and have Shieldred alive, but they just didn't have any way to instantly interact with her. So very fun card. I think it's worth it in here because you're probably going to get some upside out of it. It will not shut down some of the combos that the CEDH folks use. So this we'll talk about power level, overall power level of this deck at the end, but this is not like the be all end all, but it's a very strong card. Highly recommend it. Howling Mine, because it gives you more cards, and this works with a lot of your card draw punishers that are in the deck. So at the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. So they're basically just drawing 2 cards and hopefully losing extra life because of the extra card draw and so on. So it's a good card. This one, it can enable your opponents, so you might want to be careful when you play it, or it might not be worth putting in the deck, but for like having Shieldred and some of the other cards in here, I think it's worth it. All right, then we're going to get into some cards that you can use to be finishers by forcing people to draw cards with your card drawing punishers on the battlefield. So you can pay X and 2 black for Damnable Pack. Target player draws X cards and loses X life. So in addition to losing that X life, they could also be losing 2 life for each of those cards that they've drawn. So if X is 7 and Shieldred's on the battlefield, they're going to be losing 21 life. It's a nice way to pop people at the end because, as I said before, generally speaking, when this deck is being played in a pod, everybody's life is staying pretty close together, but all ticking downward together. So you're going to find most of the pod is going to be down lower and lower each turn because everybody's taking advantage of it or getting ticked by some of your abilities or what have you. So it's pretty common to see, by like the mid game to be see people down in the 20s or lower, just across the board, like everybody's life total within a couple life of each other. And this is a great way to end a bigger threat. Eldritch Pact is another one. You can pay 6 generic and a black. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of cards in their graveyard. This is obviously better against certain deck types or certain points in the game. Not everybody goes through a bunch of cards and ends up with a bunch of cards in their graveyard. So against some targets, this is not a useful card at all. But against some of them, especially people that are trying to interact with their graveyard more frequently, you can really pop them out of the blue, make them draw those cards, and then take a bunch of life to kill them. Peer into the Abyss. This one's going to end the game if you have Shieldred on the battlefield. There's really almost no way not to kill somebody because they're going to draw cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and lose half their life. Round it up each time. So outside of like a few very rare situations, they're almost always going to have more than like 4 cards, or more than like I don't know, 10 or 15 cards in their deck or something like that. So it's almost always going to be a kill if you play this on somebody. Now with these card draw, if you have Shieldred, you could also target yourself and gain even more life back. So these aren't necessarily offensive, but I would highly recommend at least considering them as such. Like I just assume that I'm going to use them to end the game or end somebody's game. And then if I happen to target myself and get a bunch of life and draw a bunch of cards, then hey, so much the better. But I put these in with the intent of being a finisher, not necessarily being an enabler for me. But they certainly can act that way. Then you got Village Rites. So the next 2 here are basically just ways to draw cards. So sack a creature, draw a card. Sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw 2 cards, and create a treasure. Village Rites is sack a creature and draw 2 cards. So this one costs 1 more, but you do get a treasure out of it, and you can choose to sacrifice an artifact instead. And then Black Market Connections, which has a lot of different things going for it. I was kind of debated about which pile I wanted to put this in. But basically, you pay 2 generic and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, choose 1 or more. You can sell contraband to create a treasure token and lose a life. You can buy information to draw a card and lose 2 life. Or you can hire a mercenary to create a 3/2 colorless shapeshifter creature token with changeling and lose 3 life. Depending on your life total and state of the game, you'll probably pick at least the card draw, maybe the treasure, depending. It really depends. I usually will pick all 3 because all 3 are valuable in this deck. I may not prioritize the card draw as much if I'm already getting a ton of cards in hand, and it really doesn't matter, and I kind of know what I'm going to do for the turn. But getting the treasure is always nice, and then getting an extra body is nice for just 4 life essentially. So treasure and a 3/2 for 4 life is almost always a good deal. All right, so then we're going to get into, I think these are all just tutors, so it is black. We got access to lots of tutors. I just didn't have an extra copy to put demonic in here, but I got most of the others. So vampiric tutor, of course, just got a reprint, great card. Diabolic Intent, just got a reprint in Brothers War, great card. You do lose a creature, but you will probably have a lot of cheap creatures, so it's not as big of a deal. Imperial Seal, also just got a reprint. Search your library for a card, shuffle it, put it on top, you lose 2 life. Play this in main phase 1, hit somebody with Gixx or with Gixx on the battlefield, and you draw the card. So, oops, sorry, didn't mean to hit the camera there. So this one, and if I had demonic, like this one in vampiric, it's great to be able to have access to so much card draw because you're almost guaranteed to draw these on your turn if you set it up correctly. And finally, Grim Tutor. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand, shuffle your library, lose 3 life. So they're all tutors. Most people are familiar with them. Black has access to probably the best ones because it's any card, and it's generally going into your hand very soon after casting, if not immediately with this deck. Okay, then we got our different types of removal. Again, black excels at this. So a lot of single target removal. So we feed the swarm, destroy target creature, or enchantment an opponent controls, you lose life equal to that permanent's mana cost. I kept this one in here over some of the other ones because it lets you target enchantments, which historically can be difficult to interact with, especially for black. So I think that this one has a lot of value just for that alone, but 2 mana to destroy a creature isn't bad either. Defile, pay 1 black, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each swamp you control. There's a lot of swamps. You have cards in here that create more swamps essentially, or make every land a swamp. And this gets around things like indestructible. So it's just a good card. You have a good chance of killing whatever it is that you're targeting, unless it's like a very high power or a very high toughness monster of some kind. Dismember, you can pay 1 and 2 Phyrexian, which can either be a black or 2 life for each of those. Target creature gets -5/-5 till end of turn. So this is, I mean, you could essentially play this turn 1, really. Pay 1 generic and 4 life, and you could -5/-5 a creature, but it's another nice way to get around indestructible. I would say you're probably not going to run into as many indestructible creatures that have greater than 5 toughness. Obviously, some of the Eldrazi and some of the really big creatures are a different story, but in your average game, this is good enough to kill most creatures. Slaughter Pact, this is one of the packs, so it costs nothing when you cast it to destroy target non-black creature. Then at the beginning of your next upkeep, you must pay 2 generic and a black. If you don't, you lose the game. So you're essentially deferring the cost until later. 3 mana is not bad, and we will, unless you're playing this on like turn 1, you're almost always going to have the mana available to cast this or to pay for it. But there's definitely some limitations. You can't target black creatures, which is can be challenging sometimes, and then you do have to pay later. Infernal Grasp, destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. So decent value for what it does there. I mean, losing 2 life is kind of sad, but for only 2 mana, it's pretty good. Soul Shatter is 2 generic and a black. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest CMC among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So this is a nice way to get around indestructible again, to make sure that people are blowing up their biggest or most expensive stuff. And it also targets planeswalkers, so it's a pretty good value. A little bit situational, but generally speaking, you probably want to kill the highest value creatures anyways, so it's just not bad. Here's Downfall, destroy target creature or planeswalker. So again, this has an alternate target there, so you can target planeswalkers, which we otherwise will struggle a little bit to do. Damnation, here's one of our board wipes. Destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated for 2 generic and 2 black. So this is our Black Wrath of God. Definitely worth having in here. And finally, Gixx's Command. This one is, again, another card out of Brothers War. It's part of the command cycle. So you pay 2 black and 3 generic, and you choose 2. So, and I have used all of these at different times. This is a great utility card. 5 mana is a little on the pricey side, but it can really be useful. And honestly, I've probably tutored for this card more than any other card in the deck, outside of maybe Shieldred or one of the lands that we'll talk about. But generally speaking, this is one of my top tutor targets. So you choose 2. First one you can choose is put 2 1/1 counters on up to 1 creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Buffing up your creatures, especially those 1/1s that can't be blocked, and giving them lifelink is super useful, because that 1/1 unblockable creature becomes a lot scarier when it's a 3/3 unblockable creature, especially when you start talking about some of the equipment and stuff that we put in this deck. You can destroy each creature with power 2 or less. This is a great sweeper for anybody that goes wide with like tokens and stuff. You can return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand, or each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control, which is also very helpful because it gets around indestructible, and a lot of times it's not the highest cost, it's the highest power. So again, a little bit situational, but a lot of times those high power ones are the ones you want to kill anyways, or get rid of anyways. So it is a good choice. Definitely one of my favorite cards to use in the deck. All right, finally, before we get into land, we got some of the different ways that we can generate extra mana. So Dark Ritual is a classic. No reason not to put it in here. You pay a black, you get 3 black. Just really solid. This actually will allow you to play Gixx on turn 1. If you get it in your opening hand, Gixx is coming out turn 1, which is great. Not a lot of better options there. Jet Medallion, your black spells cost 1 less to cast. Just a classic part of the medallion cycle. No reason not to put it in here. If you have it and can afford it, it is pricier. We did just see it get reprinted in the Post Malone Secret Lair, and I haven't looked to see if the prices were affected that much, but that hopefully let them tick down a little bit. We haven't really seen a reprint from the medallions in a while. But, I know they did it in some of the commanders. I just don't remember what year commander that was. So it's we're probably getting close to 10 years since we've seen like a true reprint for all the medallions. But this one in particular just had one a couple of months ago. Caged Sun, another great card. It's not a tribal card. It's just a color card. So you pay 6 generic and choose a color, and obviously black for this deck. Creatures of the chosen color get +1/+1. That helps almost all of our creatures outside of like Phyrexian, Fleshgorger, Gingerbrute, Psychosis Crawler. I think there might be 1 or 2 others, but generally speaking, all of our creatures are going to benefit from that. And more importantly, whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana of that color. It is great to be able to tap for 2 mana for each of your swamps, especially with how much card draw we generally have with this deck. Really, really valuable. It is an expensive card. May not be worth casting in some board states or some situations, some gameplay situations, but generally speaking, it's worth having in the deck at least because it's a good option. Decanter of Endless Water, this one came out of Baldur's Gate. Biggest thing for this is you have no maximum hand size. It is a 3 mana rock, but it does tap for black, which is nice. So you're paying 3 to tap for black and no maximum hand size. Well worth the 3 mana in this deck because you are oftentimes going to generate far more cards in hand than 7. So I would highly recommend prioritizing all the no maximum hand size cards that you can, including Thought Vessel, which costs less but only taps for a colorless. So again, no maximum hand size. Then of course Arcane Signet, worth having in here, gives you that 2 mana for black. Soul Ring, it's classic, no reason not to have it in here. And then Expedition Map is quite nice. You pay 1 generic, and then you can pay 2 generic to tap sack it, to search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. It does go into your hand, but it's any land card. And as we'll see shortly, we got some land cards we would love to get down pretty early to really get extra value out of our mana generation. All right, and then we got our land base, and as you can see, this first card is not a land at face value, but I choose when I'm building this deck, or when I built this deck, I built it with this card, just assuming it's probably going to come down as a land. So Malakir Rebirth, you can pay 1 black, choose target creature, you lose 2 life. Until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So you are, it's basically a way to save a creature, bring a regenerated creature more or less. But you can also use it for its other side, which is it's essentially a tapped black mana land when it comes into play. So not too bad. I like having it in there. I think it's worth it. You might get value out of the top half, but at a minimum, you can always play it for a black if you need to. So this deck has 28 lands, with this being 29 if you want to count it as a land. I know that's very low, but I have had very good, reliable success in my monocolored decks, this one in Svelund in particular, with having that lower land count. And especially with these two decks, because the overall mana curve is definitely on the low side. So you'll have, as you saw, a lot of the deck is 3 CMC or less, or 3 mana value or less. So you're not as worried about getting stuck with only 2 or 3 lands for a few turns, because you can still do what you need to do. It just kind of slows you down a little bit. All right, then we'll get into some of the more utility type lands. So Rogue's Passage, of course, great card. You can pay 4 to tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. We like unblockable creatures in this deck. It is probably the top thing we can do to enable all of our advantages, and it also helps by connecting with face and killing your opponents. So very strong. You can also pay 2 generic to tap it. Each player draws a card. This is quite good, especially with the card draw punishers that we have in the deck. So I think it's worth having in here. And then you can also tap it for a colorless. Oops. Then we got Takenuma, Abandoned Mire. This is part of the cycle lands from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It's a legendary land that comes into play untapped. You can just tap it for a black, which I do most of the time. But you can pay 2 generic and a black to channel it, where you discard it, mill 3 cards, and then return a creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. And it costs 1 less to cast for each legendary creature you control. So you could conceivably get it down to just 1 black to recur a card from your graveyard to your hand. In this version of the deck, I have not prioritized recursion quite as heavily. I think I have a little bit more in my Arena Historic Brawl version of the deck, but I also don't have access to all the cards that are Commander legal in Historic Brawl. So I didn't prioritize recursion quite as heavily. So this is a nice way to get like Shieldred or Phyrexian Fleshgorge or some of the other heavy hitters back to get them out on the battlefield. Reliquary Tower, we like no maximum hand size. This is another great way to do it, and it's much harder to interact with this one. So always worth putting in this deck. And then we get into some of our Make More Mana Please cards. So we got Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. We saw this in the Merfolk, Svelund Merfolk deck. I would highly recommend it in any monocolored deck, unless you just really don't care about generating a bunch of mana. But you pay, or you can tap it to add 1 colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 to tap it and choose a color and add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. So that means that for however many of the black mana symbols you have on the battlefield amongst all your permanents, you will be adding that much mana to it. And we have lots of black creatures, lots of enchantments and stuff like that. It's only permanents, so Gixx's command was a bad example, but say you had like Underworld Dreams out there, suddenly you're paying 2 to get 3 mana right off the bat there, which is great. Technically paying 3 because you're tapping Nykthos as well, so you're losing access to 3 lands to generate that. But as long as you have 4 or more black mana symbols on your permanents, then you're already coming out ahead. So very strong card. It is expensive. It's probably due a reprint, in all honesty. For it being such a commander staple, it's a little pricey, but it's worth it for if you really want to invest in a monocolored deck. This is a top card to get, and it's good in any monocolor. So it's not specific like some of the ones coming up, like Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, which is also very expensive and did just get a reprint in Time Spiral Remastered. But this is another staple for this deck in particular, for mono black. Each land is a swamp in addition to its other land types. Very good. It works quite well with some of the cards we're going to talk about here in a moment. Some of the land cards also works well with the, forget the name of the creature, but the one that cares about swamps entering the battlefield. So quite good. And this is one that it wants to have on the battlefield with it. Cabal Coffers. You can pay 2 generic to tap it, add a black for each swamp you control. And with Urborg, all your lands are swamps. So a lot of times I will end up, depending on the board state, I'll end up tutoring for either Urborg, Cabal, or Nykthos. But those are just such high payoff, especially with how rapidly we can draw through our deck. Cabal Coffers is kind of the poor man's, Cabal Stronghold is kind of the poor man's Cabal Coffers, because you have to pay 3 generic and tap it to add a black for each basic swamp you control. So this does not interact with Urborg because it only cares about basic swamps. But it's still quite good. We have a lot of swamps in the deck, and you might get some value out of it. And then the only fetch land of any type that we have in this deck is Myriad Landscape, because it lets us pull 2 lands out there. So I think it has value. It's a little slow, but our mana curve is so low that we can afford sometimes to play this, let it untap, pay the 2, bring 2 out, because we can still play other cards from our hand, and a lot of times this will enable us to put out some of our heavy hitters earlier, while still being able to do anything. So it's not like it's unlikely we would lose entire turns with Myriad Landscape like some decks would. So I think it's worth it. And then the rest of our lands are swamps, and as you can see, we have quite a few. So yeah, so that is Gixx, Yawgmoth Praetor, mono black. It's a ton of fun. This is one of I try to cycle through my decks frequently so that I'm not always playing the same decks for myself, but also letting my opponents face other things. And this is one that I come back to a lot. Even though I built it recently, I've probably played this deck more than some of my other decks that I've had for longer. Highly, highly recommend it. Monocolor can be a little tough in some cases with Commander, but I think that Gixx is a really strong card. And like I said before, you could probably decently swap Gixx for Shieldred and not change the deck at all if you wanted to spice it up a little bit or try something different, because they both kind of interact well with each other. It's Shieldred. Shieldred is a lot more powerful with Gixx on the board. However, Gixx doesn't care quite as much about Shieldred. Your life total might care, but Gixx in general isn't going to be as affected by not having her out as she would be not having him out. Overall, as far as like power level goes, I know it's subjective. I would say that this is a pretty strong 8.5, somewhere in there, maybe 9, depending on who you're playing against. It's still a deck that wants to attack, and there's a lot of ways to deal with that, especially since a lot of your creatures are smaller. We kind of cheat around that with unblockable creatures, with a lot of creatures with death touch that maybe your opponents don't want to trade with. So I think that you're generally, more times than not, you're going to get value, but there will be times where you are stuck. You can't attack because your opponents just have so much chaff in the way, like say you're playing like an elf deck or something, or there's like a Scoot Swarm on the battlefield, and they can just throw a ton of tokens at everything that you have, and you don't have your unblockables out. You can reach situations where you're just kind of stuck, and that sucks. But generally speaking, if you're stuck and somebody else is going off, the rest of the table is going to be targeting them, and you'll quickly return to a point where you can kind of get back to business. So there are some downsides. Obviously, control is going to wreak havoc with you because we don't have a way to counteract that, because we don't really have counter magic in this sense. Anything that's like just relentlessly destroying your battlefield is rough. This deck's probably less concerned about the sweepers, about like the board clears and stuff, just because we have so many options or so many cheap creatures to refill the board with, but we really need that card draw to go off. All in all, though, I think it's a very balanced deck. I think it's a lot of fun. It's definitely more aggro, very much more aggro than any other archetype, in my opinion. But it enables your opponents, or it incentivizes your opponents to take advantage of Gixx by attacking other people and not destroying him. So you have reasons for your opponents not to want to mess with you until later in the game, when you start to punish their card draw instead of enabling it, or instead of only enabling it. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it. I know this is probably one of our longer ones, but this is a really fun deck. I absolutely love it. Highly recommend it. If you ever get a chance, try it out, because Gixx is just a blast to play. And honestly, all the Brothers War commanders that I've tried so far have been awesome. I love what came out of that set, and I want to build more. I haven't built any of the meld decks as commanders yet, and I want to do that too. But you'll see some of my other ones as we go along on the process here. But I wanted to share Gixx because it's just a ton of fun, and I kind of have him more or less where I want him. I have seen, just real quick, I have seen on Arena, people do a combo with Aetherflux Reservoir and Bolas' Citadel. Because the deck is so cheap, a lot of times you'll come out net positive very quickly in that scenario with the cards that you're playing. So just because of the amount of spells that you can cast. With multiple opponents and 40 life, it's probably not going to be quite as devastating as it was to face against, but it's an option. I thought about putting it in, decided not to, because that's not really the way I wanted to go with the deck. So yeah, so anyways, like I said, I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you liked what you saw, please give us a like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. We have new content coming out every week. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we have our pack cracking episodes, and then Saturdays, which is what you're watching right now probably, we have the deck tech videos that come out. So yeah, and throw some comments down there. We'll love to hear what everyone's thoughts are. Has anybody else been playing with Gixx or played against him? I know it's one of the more popular commanders that's come out of Brothers War. So, but again, there's like just so many good commanders in Brothers War. I'm seeing all these decks being played, and it's great. It's such a good set for that in general. So, all right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed it, and until next time, have a great day.